been asked just to remind you of the logistics, which is that after our speaker has given lecture number 3, there will be a break where you can enjoy coffee in a local cafe. We'll come back for the 11:30 lecture, and at the end of that there will be a chance to ask questions. So it's my great pleasure to welcome back to the podium our fabulous Bampton Lecturer for 2021, the Reverend Dr. Jessica Martin, who's a Residentiary Canon of Ely Cathedral, speaking on the theme of the Eucharist. Jessica.
Thank you very much for your welcome. It's a great pleasure to be giving the Bampton Lectures, and a particular and unusual pleasure to be giving it to actual people as well as people watching online. Thank you. We'll start with place. Since I am coming to that holy room where, with thy choir of saints for evermore I shall be made thy music. As I come, I tune the instrument here at the door, and what I must do then, think here before. Whilst my physicians by their love are grown cosmographers, and I their map, who lie flat on this bed, that by them may be shown that this is my southwest discovery, per fratum fabris, by these straits to die, I joy that in these straits I see my west, for, though their currents yield return to none, what shall my west hurt me? As west and east in all flat maps, and I am one, are one, so death doth touch the resurrection. Is the Pacific Sea my home, or are the eastern riches, is Jerusalem? Anyan and Magellan and Gibraltar, all straits and none but straits are ways to them, whether where Japheth dwelt, or Ham, or Shem. We think that paradise and Calvary, Christ's cross and Adam's tree stood in one place. Look, Lord, and find both Adams met in me. As the first Adam's sweat surrounds my face, may the last Adam's blood my soul embrace. So in his purple wrapped receive me, Lord. By these his thorns give me his other crown. And, as to others' souls I preached thy word, be this my text, my sermon to mine own. Therefore, that he may raise, the Lord throws down. That was the poet and priest John Donne, writing about the work of dying. He probably made the poem in 1623, when both London, where he lived, and his own body were full of potentially lethal infection. He called it Hymn to God, my God, in my sickness. Donne's poem represents the parameters of his dying self, a self of the body and its perceptions. His metaphors of place play highly characteristic games with size, boundaries, and dimensions. Space and time are malleable, but not separable. The poem's speaker is a little world, a small, sentient piece of earth with unbounded imaginative reach. Donne used the little world image in another piece of writing, pondering self-isolation during the same illness. Here, confined and dying, this speaker nevertheless contains everything. Infinite divine vistas arise from mortal limits, vistas as real and realer than anything the dying body might immediately touch, see, or feel. His physical body, flat on this bed, as still and as supine as the blocks of words on the flat page, is also febrile and protean in its constant change. So, he's sick, he's about to be turned into pure sound. No, he's a map. No, he's toiling feverishly through a confined and choppy channel. In fact, he's Magellan, the adventurer, or maybe he's the place Magellan sailed through. He's the whole world, he's a sphere, he's a flat square. Oh no, wait. He's folded his square into a circle. He's made the edges meet, so presumably he's become some sort of cylinder. He's Adam, he's Christ, he's upright, planted like a tree, like a cross. He's in the pulpit, he's in the pew, listening to himself. He's shamed, he's royal, he's dead, he's alive, he's toppled flat. He'll stand. Yep, it's a poem by Donne, all right. The fierce, chunkily awkward orderliness of his grammar and versifying conceals, or partly conceals, the hallucinatory tumble that they hold in place. Donne's experience presents as physical spaces, closely resembling the dream landscapes of fever, where the body's pain and discomfort assume concrete but uncontrollable forms. It's tempting to wonder how much of Donne's adult life he spent with a high temperature. For Donne, though, that heightened strangeness allows him to picture not illusion, but a different kind of real. Enfolded in these physical places, there is the unseen landscape of the soul's journey to another country, far beyond the stars. Ferdinand Magellan first named the Magellan Strait the Strait of All Saints, Estrecho de Todos los Santos. Donne's poem, turning on a pun between strait as narrow endurance and strait as sea channel, translates that same perfectly real sea route into the narrows of the Ars Moriendi, the last arduous journey to physical dissolution undertaken by, yes, all saints. And this is only the most newfangled of his bits of sacred geography. Along with the discovered vistas of hitherto unknown but real places, offered here as metaphors for otherworldly revelation, are the ancient landscapes of faith. All undiscovered lands are also the plantings of Noah's sons, Shem and Ham and Japheth, spread long ago at God's command to the ends of the wide earth. Jerusalem and its environs, city of spiritual home, appears again at different ends of God's chronology as the ground, the same ground, for innocence and for redemption, for paradise and for Calvary. Like the dying body containing it, the holy city is both primordial garden and a violently inscribed deathly wasteland. Donne isn't playing a clever game of spiritual fantasy football. This is not word spinning in order to make himself feel better about his own potential extinction. He got better, by the way. He holds a view of reality very different from ours. The fractured epistemology of early modernity has made relatively few inroads into his modes of knowing. Therefore, he makes his poem out of metaphors which conceive material stuff, the stuff of world and of physical body, to be holy. The reality of God inheres in embodied experience, real places, real flesh. Even the disorder of a feverish perception bespeaks God's presence. Donne is unlikely to fall into the common mistake of the modern consciousness. He won't be assuming bodily perception to be a completely reliable external picture of an insentient world. Such an assumption must also assume that all unlikely perceptions are deviations from the unchanging, predictable norm of the real. Donne doesn't have to think that. For him, the world and our bodily perceiving of it are in a counterpoint of mutual knowledge, disclosing the unpredictable, the uncommandable presence of God. He knows that the body's responses can deceive. He wrote a sermon insisting that those feeling physical terror in their final hours should not see that terror as a sign of God's abandonment. But he was not tempted, as we are, to confine God's power to that illusory construct, incorporeal thought. The locational boundaries of Donne's sacred knowing, west for death and the setting sun, east for life and its rising, tell of God's unlocated, unbeginning, unending, timeless being. The flat square folds up into the eternity of the circle, as round as the round world it depicts, so that west and east touch. Death doth touch the resurrection. Eternity is as much more present than the mortal conceptions of space and time as the real round world is than the flat map which denotes it. Donne's body, the flat map in question, looks in this poem towards acquiring a third dimension. Last week, we thought about the Eucharist in linear form as thought and argument, and in two-dimensional form as a flat object apprehended by the eye. This week, we bring Eucharist into place, into bodies and actions, and finally, in the last lecture, into the work of time. It's fitting, if coincidental, that today's lectures themselves come into 3 dimensions and may happen in person and in place, at least for a few, as last week's could not. I began with Donne's poem because it is 3-dimensional in a particular way. In it, bodily experience, physical place, and historical time are the grounds for eternal transformation, of being changed in the twinkling of an eye. The poem is set at a real turning point between death and resurrection within the experience of dying. Being a poem, and not itself a bodily event, this turning point is textually rendered, so it's a repeatable picture of experience and not experience itself. And as we know, he didn't in fact die. The sacrament of Eucharist is also made out of bodily experience, physical place, and historical time in order to bring about eternal transformation. Like Donne's poem, but by different means, it provides a repeatable version of itself, of structure, words, and action within a place. Each iteration of its repeatable form is both a transformation of its own within time, space, and bodies as we experience them now and here, and an anticipatory taste of eternal transformation in the hereafter, when repetition will no longer have to act as our stuttering imitation of endlessness. Receiving the Eucharist is realer, but also therefore more fleeting than reading Donne's poem, because the Eucharist happens to our bodies in time, much as love poetry and the act of love offer very differently constituted joys. Our text-obsessed sensibility tends to see the Eucharist as dominated by thought and word, but thought and word are servants to its manifestation as event. I've called it theatre because theatre offers the closest analogy for its mixture of script with action and location. Theatre itself, of course, has its roots in the sacred, within and beyond Christianity. Like theatre, Eucharist needs location of some kind, but can be translated to multiple locations which may be very different. And, like theatre, the movable event may also contain, within its script and instructions, symbolic traces of the sacred place where the event was first performed. You don't have to see Sophocles in the theatre at Ephesus to see how the theatre at Ephesus shaped the drama of Sophocles. Nor do you have to know the sacred geography of Jerusalem to envisage either the Last Supper or the Holy City of Revelation. Yet that lost city's traces are all over the Eucharist. Some of those traces are easier to see than others. Our Eucharistic prayers reiterate the words and actions of Jesus in the upper room in Jerusalem on the night of his arrest, as reported in the Synoptic Gospels and in Paul's first letter to the church at Corinth. And that's easy to see. But in this emphasis on symbolic reenactment, there are also less obvious signs of the lost city. According to Gregory Dix, the Eucharist shifted the balance of its emphasis from eschatological hope to historical reenactment in the 4th century, at the point that the Church was embraced and publicly established by the Emperor Constantine. As this worldly Christianity becomes safer for its believers, so Dix argues, Christians look back more and forward less. They're comfortable to live within the historical events of the world. They're not expecting sudden death, so they don't have to think about heaven quite so much, and can instead choose public social life as a Christian without fear. In the process of establishing Christianity, the particular places of the Christian narrative of redemption acquire a public holiness. Constantine made it his business to sacralize the places for Jesus' passion and death, beautifying and building on them. Cyril of Jerusalem, bishop during this transformation and a citizen of Jerusalem from childhood, saw the change as it took place. It was a garden where he was crucified, he writes. For though it has now been most highly adorned with royal gifts, yet formerly it was a garden, and the signs and remnants of this remain. Sacred buildings make Jerusalem into a site of pilgrimage. Indeed, the contested nature of its sacred soil is a fact of which we could not be more aware than we are this week. Back in the 4th century, Cyril's renewed liturgy arises from the ritualized physical retracing of the events of Holy Week, moving from numinous site to numinous site. The itinerary of worship, literal itinerary of worship across the city, is recorded in the diary of a visiting nun, Egeria. However, the liturgies which suit the commemoration of a place where Jesus really was are not very exportable to places where he really wasn't. Cyril's own lectures to those preparing for baptism tend to point towards the actual landscape of faith because it's on his doorstep. Seest thou this spot of Golgotha? He asks his hearers. And he doesn't mean it metaphorically, he means it's out of the window. They shout their assent. But in order for the event of Eucharist to keep its stability wherever it happens, you need a template that will go anywhere. The honouring of actual places within worship and the physical travelling between them have to acquire a symbolic form that can happen in every place, independent of the geography of ancient Jerusalem. And to solve this, place is translated to time. The Liturgy of Holy Week is a temporal form of a physical journey, travelling through days instead of streets, time instead of space. It's still a process which changes the pilgrim, but the processing, or perhaps the processing, happens differently. Just as Donne's word before in his line, "and what I must do then, think here, before," denotes progression both in time, from dying to being dead, and space, hesitating in front of the door of heaven and then entering it. So liturgists make our soul's journey temporal as well as spatial. Space is a common metaphor for time, which makes it easy and strangely unnoticeable when it's used. Yet, in a sense, every church on Maundy Thursday becomes the lost Jerusalem. A little later, in the 6th century, the chant of Vexilla Regis, the royal banners forward go, started life as a processional, sung while a piece of the true cross was carried in pomp from Tours to its resting place in a monastery in Poitiers. For those without a piece of the true cross, the procession and its chant could be put into Holy Week devotions. The true cross ceased to be physical. It became instead a liturgical imagining of the cross, an inner realization of a vanished object. Reformers, looking back on the early history of the Church, go through phases of saying that the rot set in with Constantine, loading us down with big, expensive buildings, the worship of material stuff, public life, establishment and its corruptions, and the morally dubious exercise of political power. Before that, Christianity was innocent, short on possessions, didn't do idolatry, and everyone worshipped at home in a really lovely way. They never had to raise money to keep the church roof on, and they all understood that it was inner faith that mattered and not the outward show of material things. There's as much back projection as truth in such constructions of the past. All organisations, big and small, are riven with the politics of power, and the New Testament makes it perfectly plain that the early church was no exception. And if buildings and locations became particular sites of the sacred with Constantine, then the bones of saints and martyrs were doing a very similar job before that. All through its history, the Church has lurched between iconic and iconoclastic sensibilities, sometimes seeing material stuff like buildings and relics as a helpful incarnational anchoring, and sometimes rejecting it violently. Stuck in the centre of it all, the Eucharist, rite of corporeal transformation, cracks down the middle with the strain. Because if we can't agree whether physical ritual is a way to God or an obstacle to him, we also can't agree, or at least not stably, under what conditions the language of the Eucharist makes things happen. Sacred action is performative, in the sense in which the philosopher J.L. Austin used the term in his famous lectures, How to Do Things with Words. Austin argued that under certain contextual conditions, utterances could make things happen in the world, rather than simply reporting or describing happenings. The umpire who declares a ball to be out in cricket was one of his examples. Another example was a marriage vow, yet others were making a bet or ratifying a legal agreement. He was, however, very clear that every example required the conditions of its context. Outside the game of cricket, the umpire's words have no power. Outside the marriage ceremony and its legal adjuncts, there is no vow, a point perhaps missed by Meghan Markle. In the majority of his cases, context meant a three-dimensional, acted-out set of culturally agreed practices. Austin was interested in situations where performative utterances were not accepted by all participants, where there was no consensus about their binding nature. The example he gives is dueling, where if one person won't accept the effectiveness of the challenge, there is nothing the other person can do about it. You could argue that our public life is full of misfired performatives at the moment. From the political efficacy of presidential concession speeches to the reality of European legal agreements. They demonstrate that our society's cultural impatience with the rules of ritual makes us especially vulnerable to destructive division. This is because division happens when ritually representative figures snap the cultural bonds of their own performatives in the pursuit of a short-term gain. Ignoring performatives is therefore a sign of an institution beginning to break. It may be significant that the word performative in ordinary usage has shifted away from Austin's precise meaning. It now means speech treated as a theatrically fictive performance. This has happened just at the point where habitual demonstrative lying has become normalized within major democracies. For the Eucharist, the institutional breaking point happened long ago and in a different way. Long before we decided that words were not necessarily binding at all, we could not agree in all good conscience on what kind of bond they were. It was a clash of contrasting modes of understanding how God operates in the world. We have been living within the scattered signs and remnants of its meaning for centuries, even millennia, living among baskets full of the broken pieces of Christ's body. The ground is littered with gifts we don't know how to handle. As Eucharist is a ritual of breaking as well as making, it's no surprise to us that its own processes break as well as make. How may we in our symbolic practice maintain a stable balance between the violence of the broken body and the nourishment of Jesus as gift, between the presence and absence of the body we honour, between the signs and remnants in historical report and the expectant glimpses of Christ's coming again, between the mortal bodies and actions of the ritual here and now, and the invisible, eternal past and future it instantiates, between the simple, helpless love of remembering and the world-changing power of remaking. At the heart of our conflict over Eucharistic performance lies our difficult relationship with its performatives. Within the wide arc of Christians for whom participating in a Eucharist is significant, we have no consensus about what happens and how. In Anglicanism, a tradition which generously attempts to contain opposed epistemological convictions, we worry about looking too hard at the performative qualities of its ritual in case the whole edifice flies apart. We can make our sacrament of unity the site for fierce division. We did that. Or we can keep the conditions of our performative utterance so vague that they might not be binding at all. That's what we're doing now. So we have technical arguments on the nature of required gesture or clothing or what actual words would be the core performatives, but these arguments are now, in practice, largely ignored. Historically, they were a source of actual schism. And this wasn't because the people of the past were more unreasonable than modern people. It was because they took the ritual context of performatives more seriously than we do. Then there are our internal or inter-church arguments about whether only a priest can make the performative binding, and indeed about what category of person can be deemed to be a priest. These are arguments that are still extremely live, but even they can begin to have a technical, semi-redundant look to them in a church where the Archbishop of Canterbury can choose to stand by during an outdoor Eucharist, leaving the children around him to bless, consecrate and distribute the Peter and juice boxes, which represent the bread and wine. For many of those within his church, that would be a beautiful agape meal, but not a Eucharist. For others, it would emphatically be a Eucharist, because the priest's actions as priest would not for them be the conditions which make the performative do its work. Last of all, for our internal arguments, there is who receives, whether the table is open or closed, what kind of conditions will open a closed table for those on the outside. What is it to receive unworthily, to use the words of Paul? No one knows. On the whole, within most forms of Anglicanism, there's a general, the Holy Spirit will complete our ritual deficiencies, so why worry? It's not like we do it ourselves or even understand its mystery, they will say. So it won't matter if there are lots of cracks in how we understand it. Surely the cracks will just let the light in. That is the spirit in which we understand how something can be a Eucharist which we watch, but at which we are not present, do not meet anyone else, make no audible sound, do not receive, and may be worshipping at a completely different time. I do have quite a lot of sympathy with this cracks let the light in view. Like most faithful people, I rely heavily on the mercy of God to supply our human deficiencies, in life as in worship. But I don't think this means we should be indifferent to those deficiencies or ignore their consequences, for they do have consequences, or give up on attempting to mend rather than to ignore what is broken in how we worship and in how we live. We have no idea how to catechize. When we are indifferent to ritual, we dilute what it may give to us and to those who might ask us what we are doing and why we do it. Just as a game without rules ceases to be a game, a ritual without boundaries becomes something other than a ritual. God doesn't need our worship. Do you think I drink the blood of goats when mine are the cattle on 1,000 hills, as the psalmist puts it? But we do. Late in their relationship with the Indonesian converts of Sumba, the Calvinist missionaries thought it might be a nice cultural gesture to invite the Sumbanese to add their traditional spirit drums to Christian worship. This was because the missionaries didn't believe that the spirit drums called spirits. But for at least some of those converts, the spirit drums still had power. If they were to say yes, they would not only be playing fast and loose with the power of the drums, they would also be saying that Christian worship was itself impervious to that power. By implication, Christian worship was such an internal process that it really didn't need to be a lived event, disruptible by the material power of another faith. The performative efficacy of ritual action in a time and a place with people doing things didn't seem to matter to it. Was it still active encounter with the power of God, or was it just making statements about God, with the work of worship taking place, or not, in each separate person's heart? Did anything happen within the material world in Christian worship? Ritual context does not hold God, but it does give us a range of graspable reference for the ineffable being who cannot be held, and a way to connect our physical being in the embodied world of place with that body's creator. The political activist Barbara Ehrenreich wrote a book called Living with a Wild God, a non-believer's search for the truth about everything. She had personal cultural and intellectual reasons to walk away from Christianity. But when she had her unwilled encounter with the wild God, the image she reached for was the impossible and impossibly physical burning bush from Exodus 3. She says this: "At some point on my pre-dawn walk, the world flamed into life. How else to describe it? There were no visions, no prophetic voices or visits by totemic animals, just this blazing everywhere. Something poured into me, and I poured out into it. It was a furious encounter with a living substance that was coming at me through all things at once. And one reason for the terrible wordlessness of the experience is that you cannot observe fire really closely without being part of it. Whether you start as a twig or a gorgeous tapestry, you will be recruited into the flame and made indistinguishable from the rest of the blaze." Unable, and indeed unwilling, to connect that living experience with the narrow, highly cerebral, coercive control of the Christianity she had known and grown up with, Ehrenreich chose to embrace a belief in a God of place, a genius loci, the living divinity of the land. She could only find her way back to the holiness of material stuff, of earth, by leaving the dualist dissociations of modern Christianity behind. The performatives of ritual have withdrawn from our public culture and public places, in Christianity as in secularized culture. They have been replaced by expressions of feeling that claim the improbable authority of sincerity. But those same performatives have burgeoned in our imaginative lives, in the realm of the unbodied and securely fictive. The fantasy genre, set off more or less by accident by the Catholic J.R.R. Tolkien, features words that make things happen, objects infused with power which change people's natures, numinous rituals in numinous places, sacred journeys, a more sublime semi-sentient landscape than you can shake a magic staff at. Early fantasy practitioners thought very seriously about the earth-shaking qualities of words which could alter the nature of things. In Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea series, mostly written in the 1970s, the magic required to change a loaf of bread into something else was infinitely more costly to its worker than the spectacular magic of illusion. 40 years later, the trope of physical transformation through the magic of words has become lazily automatic, cost less. In the quest and contest online fantasy fairy tale, the magic category solid script confers the power to bring about a change in the world through writing the word for that change. Fiat lux, at your fingertips. Code, of course, brings about change in its own context, making and realizing electronic worlds, which makes the concept that much more ordinary. In a two-dimensional world, the third dimension is itself fantasy. In other formulaic spin-offs of the online world, for example, the video games of magical quests, the avatar runs with the ease and strength of thought, simulating just enough friction with the world of the game to keep the idea of embodiment vaguely plausible. What she runs through, though, is still a numinous landscape of temples and statues, sacred rocks and physical puzzles. These worlds are frequently ruined, often falling as she runs. Like Tolkien's Middle-earth, they are full of remnants and signs. Here is a bit of a demo, not for any particular video game, but from the proud makers of game worlds, Unreal, showing off what their newest Unreal Engine can do, and therefore picking a typical landscape, which, like many such landscapes, owes a good deal to Indiana Jones on the way to pick up the Ark of the Covenant. Have a look at it. The demo's intention is to show the finesse with which their technology can create any world a games designer cares to specify. They are, rightly, particularly proud of the way they make the light fall and of the physically plausible interaction between the avatar's body and the world's surfaces with proper... The technicians of virtual reality continue to work out how to make it feel as if the player's body were inside such a world in their real, actual body. They can get the perspective, but not the touch, and it's a problem not to be able to see your feet. They want it realer, but with all the whiz of unreality added in, and no real-world consequences. In comparison, the earthbound, vulnerable ritual of Eucharist seems slow indeed. Theatre once reflected back to audiences, often powerfully and uncomfortably, the things they held most sacred. As late as the 16th century, theatre had a sufficiently unsettling resemblance both to politicised and to religious ritual action to be censored and sometimes closed down altogether. As soon as theatre became securely fictive, its range of influence became confined to comment, or even to a consumer delicacy. The other forms of imagined worlds we visit now have the same problem. It seems to me urgent that the world of Eucharist should not follow suit and turn into pure entertainment, not least because, as entertainment, it just can't compete with flying off a mountain into the setting sun. The theoretician of place, space and architecture, Robert Harbison, says of maps that they are a picture to the extent that a sacrament is a meal. You see the context of his remark on the screen. So this is the full quotation. From cities of bricks, to cities in books, to cities on maps, is a path of increasing conceptualization. A map seems the type of the conceptual object, yet the interesting thing is the grotesquely token foot it keeps in the world of the physical, having the unreality without the far-fetched appropriateness of the edibles in communion, being a picture to the extent that the sacrament is a meal. Flat maps give us the shape and orientation of something they can't replicate in all dimensions. They are very precise, a very detailed version of the rhetorical figure synecdoche, where the part stands for the whole. Synecdoche, rather than simile, might also be the figure which describes the physicality of Eucharist, where the elements are small, but, like Donne's dying body, contain and transform the world. As we receive, our mortal bodies, like flat maps, tracing the contours of our being, we take into ourselves that transformation and find ourselves remade in the new dimension. This is not fantasy. It is a performative, invoking the power of God. Imagine then the Eucharist as an act of sacred theatre, its symbols working like levers to open a door, small in themselves, but fulcrums for a movement which changes the whole meaning of the space. As with all good theatre, the irreducible elements are simple: space, bodies, words, a table laid with the basic food and drink of life. You can and might choose to have more than this, to use the whole aesthetic panoply, or you might be starkly plain. While all theatre requires an audience, sacred theatre requires those who come to be both auditors and participants, both acted upon and actors. There is no fourth wall. Whatever their reasons for entering the sacred space, however the sacred space is defined, they do not expect to leave unchanged. This is not passive viewing. It is a process that they will undergo. Those who provide the movements in the drama play out their function. That function is more than a persona, but also more significant than the person's individual character. Individual character may be part of what they use to exercise their function well, but character is subsumed to the demands of function. And because of this, personal character flaw cannot undermine the drama. Set apart to play out the breaks and cracks in human nature and human love in the eyes of God, the actors know they, being a part of those breaks and cracks, are appropriate vehicles for the drama of mending and restoration, which is God's drama. They were chosen not because they were strong, but because they were chosen. They are representative. They are obedient to that representative calling, whether of priest or musician, reader or intercessor, server or preacher. The grounds of the drama are tragic. Its losses are real and terrible. If that is not visible, then the drama is not real either. Its matter for wonder is that anything but loss could be brought out of such sorrow, such wrong. But as we look upon it, we also understand that we witness a miracle of reversal. We come here to weep, but we realize that our weeping is for a love made tangible, present in touch, in taste, in the mortal body itself, that we will not only die, and we will not only fail. We are also here to be made alive, to be freed from every debt. Because we fell, helpless to save ourselves, we are lifted up again. Therefore, that he may raise, the Lord throws down. Thank you.